Spoiler warning, this episode is neck deep in spoilers for The Last of Us, BioShock Infinite, and Hotline Miami. Seriously, we talk about endings, twists, metaphors, and themes with the assumption that you've either played the game or don't care. You've been warned.
Hold on to your asses, I'm going to say something super controversial here. We like violence in our video games. And our movies. And our sports. And our television. And our rock and roll. Alright, we're pretty much fans of violence all around. But few forms of media are as saturated with violence as video games often are. There's a few reasons for that, and, well, you know what, let's discuss that real quick. It's some good context. Why is violence so prevalent in video games? Well, number one, the simple answer is that it's an easy source of conflict and drama. These demons want to kill you, so you kill them first. Or, well, I guess that's the 90s version. These brown people want to kill you, so you kill them first. I guess I should get it out there that I'm not opposed to violent media, but I'm also not going to sit here and pretend that there aren't any problems associated with it. As gameplay, number two, it holds up fairly well to repetition, which is pretty important since most games are ultimately really repetitive. This doesn't mean that it doesn't get repetitive, it just means that there's a higher threshold before half your players get bored and walk away. Lastly, it provides the novelty of exploring transgressive or permissive scenarios. Society doesn't really tolerate punching people as a method of problem solving because, well, it doesn't really work that well and turns society into a bit of a crap hole. But we still have that lizard brain impulse that wants us to strangle the asshole who cuts us off in traffic. Violent games let us indulge in that aggression in a comparatively harmless, controlled environment. Now, I don't want that to sound like a justification or dismissal of violent media. Simply because there are reasons for something to be the way it is doesn't make that a good thing. Just because we have a craving for violence doesn't mean it's not something we shouldn't be critical of. If anything, cravings indicate things we should be most critical of, because they're the ones that are most likely to get out of control. Moving on. You really don't have to go very far to find a game that is driven by careless, nigh indiscriminate violence, but that's not what I want to talk about. How far do you have to go to find a game driven by violence that uses that violence to drive a point? In essence, how hard is it to find a game where the violence itself is part of the narrative, themes, and metaphor, and not just the expression of the conflict or the gameplay? Well, actually not that far these days. While there's still tons of games out there that are simply violent, if not reveling in that violence, there is a surprising number of games that have started to incorporate it into the narrative in order to communicate something about the characters, the world, the story, or the interactions between those elements. Many of them are, at the same time, using that violent aspect of the narrative to ask questions about the game itself, the genre, and the audience, or simply challenging the audience's complicit participation. So, let's talk about it.
The number of confirmed deaths has passed 200.
The Last of Us follows the story of Joel and Ellie, two survivors in a post-apocalyptic world where the cordyceps fungus has made the leap from arthropods and insects to humans. With social systems on the fritz and the persistent threat of infection and infected, it's everyone for themselves as the two trek west from Boston to Salt Lake in pursuit of an organization called the Fireflies, who hope to develop a vaccine from Ellie who is immune to the fungus. On this journey, Joel stabs, strangles, shoots, burns, curb stomps, and explodes basically every living thing that the two encounter. Even the few people that aren't hostile towards them, Joel threatens to kill if they get in his way. In the end, Ellie nearly drowns, but the two are rescued/captured by the Fireflies. An unconscious Ellie is rushed into surgery while Joel discovers that they plan on dissecting all of Ellie's brain to try and develop their vaccine. At this point, the blunt, brutal violence of the game transcends from game mechanic to character element. Joel goes on a rampage, killing everyone he comes across because that's all he knows how to do. After a life of violence, violence is the only tool Joel has left. As the game winds down, we realize that we have been playing in the skin of a borderline psychopath. This is actually the payoff of a theme established several times earlier in the game. Near the beginning, Tess, Joel's partner in crime, alludes to the horrible things they've done and reminds Joel that they're not the good guys. Around the midpoint, after Joel and Ellie are waylaid by bandits, we learn that Joel knows all of their tricks because he used to be one of them. After his rampage at the hospital, Joel kidnaps Ellie and lies to her about what happened while she was unconscious. In the final moments of the game, the player assumes control of Ellie and is given a chance to look at Joel objectively, not as the player avatar, but as a shallow, shattered person. A man so broken, so narrowed in vision, that the only instinct he has left is kill or be killed. The preceding 15 hours of gameplay are recontextualized, not as expression of the player's agency, but the player buying into Joel's narrow, simplistic, desperate, and selfish worldview. And the final beat is not Joel's vision of victory, but the uncertain and uncomfortable impact that so-called victory has had on the world around him.
Okay.
Oh, hey there. Welcome to Bathroom Vocabulary. The reason why it's so important for the player's control to shift from Joel to Ellie is because of attentional bias, or as TV Tropes refers to it, protagonist-centered morality. This is, in essence, the tyranny of the narrator, and is incredibly common in video games. Because of the agency we imbue the player character with, it's incredibly easy for us to slip into a mindset where whatever the protagonist does is immediately justifiable because of the way that we empathize with their worldview, even if objective data suggests that the protagonist's behavior is undesirable.
While the arc of BioShock Infinite doesn't follow the same path as The Last of Us, it uses its violence in much the same way. The game has actually received a fair bit of criticism for its brutality, which often seems out of place against the backdrop of Columbia. Compared to the pastoral and often cartoon look of the world and the characters, Booker DeWitt driving a skyhook through someone's eye seems like unnecessarily brutal imagery. But, like The Last of Us, this excess is an expression of the character and his impact on the world around him. Like Joel, Booker is a violent man who has lived a life of chaos. First in the army at the massacre of Wounded Knee, then as a union-busting Pinkerton, Booker's life has been killing, and violence is all he knows. His role in Columbia is as a bringer of violence, a sower of chaos, and his unashamed brutality sets in motion a cascade of pain and destruction. This role as a bringer of destruction, as a tool for violence, is actually something Booker knows about himself. In one conversation, Booker says the world needs revolutionaries like Fitzroy because of people like himself.
Because of folks like me.
This is in many ways an overt theme of the first half of the game, from Elizabeth's shock and horror over the massacre at Battleship Bay, leading up to Elizabeth killing Fitzroy. It's actually a fairly critical arc in the game, as it is then mirrored in the second half. As the story unravels, with its multiple timelines and alternate realities, it's revealed that the main antagonist, Zachary Comstock, a warlord using religion and patriotism as justification for his campaign of conquest, is in fact Booker from an alternate timeline, and Elizabeth is Booker's daughter taken through a tear in reality and raised by Comstock. In the first half of the game, Booker slowly, unintentionally transforms Elizabeth into a killer. At one point, she asks Booker if the killing gets easy, and he responds by saying yes, it does, faster than you would ever imagine. In the second half of the game, Elizabeth is captured by Comstock, tortured, and molded until she becomes a conquering warlord in his own image, raining fire down on New York. Indeed, as Booker said, the killing got easy. Earlier I said that Booker's brutality seems out of place against the backdrop of Columbia, but that was a bluff. The player learns fairly quickly that the idyllic setting is just a facade, that Comstock's utopia is founded on spiritual violence, racism, segregation, oppression, exploitation, and the suppression, read murder, of political opposition. While Comstock is not the only problem on Columbia, it is his personal willingness to use violence as a solution to his problems that is at the core of most of the conflicts. He had the Lutesses murdered, he imprisoned Elizabeth, he killed Lady Comstock, and he framed Fitzroy for the crime. Fitzroy's excesses are the product of Fink and Comstock's excesses, and the wheel of violence and justification continues to turn. In the conclusion, we're led to believe that it is Booker himself who is the problem, that whether he be DeWitt or Comstock, he will still carry violence and brutality in his heart, and he will pass that brutality on to his daughter, and he will inflict it on the world around him. The critical moment in the narrative is a baptism that Booker seeks out in a haze of regret over his role in the massacre of Wounded Knee. In one timeline, he rejects the baptism at the last second, resigns himself to the life of a monster, joins the Pinkertons, slips into alcohol and gambling, and sells his daughter to a strange man from another world. In the other timeline, he is reborn as Zachary Comstock, but rather than renouncing his past deeds, he rewrites them, not as shameful acts of terror, but as righteous valor. Across infinite universes, there will always be a Booker desperate enough to sell his daughter, and there will always be a Comstock ambitious enough to buy her. The only way to break the chain is for there to be no more Booker.
He's Zachary Comstock. He's Booker DeWitt.
No. I'm both.
Incidentally, just to take this all the way, it's implied in a sequence post-credits that the willingness to die in his second baptism, the acceptance of his own unworthiness and his lack of a place in a just world, was in fact indicative of a true change of heart and character, and that act did break the chain. This one's special. Hotline Miami is an incredibly violent game. Not just violence, but saturated violence. The game is almost wall-to-wall chopping, bashing, shooting, slamming, crushing, and slicing, but it does several very interesting things with this seemingly wanton violence. First is the backtracking. Now, slight side note, but I feel like it drives home why this is interesting. Backtracking, going back through areas that have already been completed, or even just areas that the player has passed through before, has become something of a dirty word in video games, to the point that many games avoid it to their own detriment. So it's already somewhat unique that Hotline Miami uses backtracking in the first place, and they manage to use it to great effect. Every level of Hotline Miami consists of a confined space that the player fights their way into until they've killed every opponent present. However, once the task is complete, the player has to backtrack through the level and return to their car. There's rarely any opponents that show up during these sequences, so presumably these are just dead space in the game, an irrelevant and redundant action that poses no challenge and has no relevance to the outcome of the game. Except, this creates a moment where the player navigates through the carnage they've left behind, absent any threat. Rather than focusing on the gameplay of navigating to the next opponent and killing them, the player is instead left to absorb the big picture of the horror show they're creating. This uneasiness is amplified as the player learns during cutscenes between missions that the main character's motivations are spurious at best. In fact, the nameless protagonist seems to ask disturbingly few questions about what's going on and why, even after he stops being rewarded for his massacres. The game criticizes the character's complicit participation in the violence, which in turn criticizes the player's willingness to act without asking questions. Early on, the game presents a number of unanswered questions that intentionally blur the line between being directed at the character and being directed at the player. The first of these questions is, do you enjoy hurting others? At the end of the game, incidentally after the credits, which is a bit of an odd theme here, but anyway, after the credits, you're given the chance to play an alternate interpretation of events as the biker. In contrast to Jacket, who asks no questions, just does what he's asked, Biker asks a lot of questions, and this is the only segment of the game where the player is given the option of leaving people alive. These are hardly the only examples in recent memory. Spec Ops: The Line, Far Cry 3, Tomb Raider, and Heavy Rain have all in one capacity or another applied a critical eye to violence in video games, whether it be exploring the impact of violence on the characters themselves, the overuse of violence for cheap drama and conflict, or the audience's seemingly endless thirst for guns and explosions. Heavy Rain does more with a single bullet than other games manage with thousands of rounds.
I'm a father too.
I think this is an interesting trend because it shows a maturing palette for critical narrative in video game stories, which is a good thing because video games, through their interactive nature, allow us to explore some subjects, like agency and interaction, in far more potent ways than cinema, books, comics, or television. There's still a place for your Mortal Kombats and Borderlands 2s, but it's refreshing to see so many creators doing more than just telling the story of that time Johnny Cage punched Kano in the dick. We're going to end this on a bit of a philosophical note, a question to think about. These games are, in some form or another, critical of their own violence, but can a game truly be critical of its own violence if it still expects you to play through beginning to end in order to get the whole message? Is there a dichotomy in that, and is that dichotomy a contradiction? And there's another really loud car. Big ol' fat truck. Yeah, you take your fat truck and keep on driving. Alright, what was I saying?